Good morning. It's good to have you all with us here. For those that are visiting, I see we have a few. This is the time when we are going to focus on the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus before we take the Lord's Supper. Today ends our spring quarter where we've been studying about the life of Jesus. And I think Brian and Adam have done a very good job in taking us through that study. But I've got to say that the study of the last days of Jesus have been rather hard to listen to. It was difficult to hear about the injustice, the treachery, the torture, and the death of an innocent man. Even more so because the study of these things was being done about the Son of God, who came to save mankind from his sin, but had this terrible tragedy happen to him. This was truly a low spot in human history. Jesus came with love, mercy, wisdom, and peace, only to have the worst of man manifested through the crucifixion story. As we studied this, I kept thinking of the many people that were involved in Jesus' death and how they must have found themselves between a rock and a hard place. Have you ever heard of this phrase, between a rock and a hard place? I'm sure some of y'all have. Someone may say this when they're in a very difficult position and facing a hard decision. A decision that really seems to have no good outcome. That's what we call between a rock and a hard place. This saying is called an idiom, and we don't use that term very often, but an idiom is an expression whose meaning is not readily known from the usual meaning. So in other words, what does a rock and a hard place have to do with making a decision? It doesn't seem readily understandable from that. However, I want to suggest that it's very easy to visualize this expression. There's a rock over here, and then there's something hard on this side of you, like maybe a wall or a cliff, and you are stuck in the middle. You're constrained on both sides, and you're unable to set yourself free. No one really wants to be in this spot, but you need to figure a way to get out of this, but it doesn't seem possible. That's called being between a rock and a hard place. So I want to look at some of the people that found themselves in this difficult position and how they handled it. And then I'd like us to look inward to ourselves and think about how we would have handled the situation ourselves. We'll first start with Pontius Pilate. We remember Pilate as the one who sentenced Jesus to death. But he did not seek out this fame. Pilate was a politician, the governor of a small region of Judea, appointed by Rome to manage the Jews, to keep the peace among the people and to gather taxes for Rome. That was his job. No one had more authority than him at that level. He had the power as a supreme judge and could make life or death decisions about his subject. The military was at his command. He could establish or abolish local laws for the people in that area. So you may ask, how could Pilate find himself between a rock and a hard place? Well, Matthew records in the 27th chapter, starting in the first verse, when morning came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people took counsel against Jesus to put him to death. And they bound him and led him away and delivered him over to Pilate, the governor. It wasn't unusual for Pilate's subjects to come before him for judgments to be made. But in this case, Pilate found himself between an angry mob and an innocent man. It is evident by the writings that Pilate believed that Jesus was innocent by the many ways he tried to set him free. First of all, he gave the Jews a choice of prisoners to set free, as was his custom during this feast. He offered Barabbas, a notorious robber, or Jesus, a carpenter's son. I think Pilate thought the choice was clear, and he thought which way the Jews would decide. But Matthew records in the 27th chapter and the 18th verse, Matthew says, Pilate knew it was out of envy they delivered Jesus, and he asked, what evil has he done? Secondly, Pilate physically washed his hands of the matter, taking a bowl of water and washing his hands, and being clearly frustrated, said, I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it to yourselves. We know that the Jews were not authorized to crucify anyone or kill anyone, and they needed Pilate to do this for them. And finally, after commanding that Jesus be scourged and humiliated, he brought Jesus back out and said, I find no guilt in him. He looked for some way to release him, but the crowd would not have it. It seems as though he really would have set him free. But then the Jews accused Pilate of not being a friend of Caesar, because Jesus claimed to be the king of the Jews. Now Pilate found himself in a hard place. Should he execute an innocent man for the envy of the people, aka a rock? Or should he protect his reputation with Caesar and show his allegiance? The hard place. Can you put yourself in his position? What would you have done? What choice would you have made? Are there any good options for Pilate in this situation? And how can he get out of this hard spot? We find that Pilate made a poor decision. Now let's turn to Simon Peter. Peter was a simple fisherman who was minding his own business on the Sea of Galilee until Jesus of Nazareth called him to leave his nets and follow him. Peter followed Jesus and became one of his closest friends and fearless disciples. He even claimed he was willing to die for Jesus' sake. Peter was destined to be someone great in the coming kingdom. He was always first to answer and willing to jump into action. We see that Jesus trusted him and protected him from Satan, who wanted to sift him like wheat. So how could Peter find himself between a rock and a hard place? When the mob came to arrest Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, we find that Peter drew his sword. And even though he knew he was outmanned and would certainly lose that fight against the Roman soldiers, he swung his sword and cut off the ear of the high priest's servant, living up to his word that he was ready to die for Jesus. But just a few hours later, things turned dramatically. John records in the 18th chapter, Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood outside the door. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door and brought Peter in. The servant girl at the door said to Peter, You also are not one of this man's disciples, are you? He said, I am not. You see, Peter found himself between an accusation that could have him arrested and possibly killed and denying his friend and master. We see that Peter denied knowing Jesus. Well, this happened 2 more times that same night, to the point that he cursed at his accusers to convince them he was not Jesus' disciple. And then the rooster crowed and Jesus made eye contact with him. Peter's world was falling apart. He had to make a snap decision when these accusations were brought to him. What would you have done in that situation? Would you have stood up and said, Yes, I am Jesus' disciple, amongst all the things that were going on there? We find that Peter made a poor decision. Now let's look at Jesus, the Son of God in the flesh, living on earth with all the power of the Creator and living among the ones he actually created. How could Jesus find himself between a rock and a hard place? We turn to Luke, the 22nd chapter. We find Jesus in the garden, starting in verse 39. Luke 22:39. And he withdrew from them about a stone's throw and knelt down and prayed, saying, Father, if you're willing to remove this cup from me, nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. And there appeared to him an angel from heaven, strengthening him. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. And when he arose from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping for sorrow. And he said, Why are you sleeping? Rise and pray that you may not enter into temptation. Soon after this, one of his own disciples, Judas, brought an armed mob to the garden and identified him with a kiss. Jesus knew what was coming. His prayer was so intense that he was sweating like great drops of blood, asking for God to choose another way for him to save mankind. Jesus found himself in a very tough spot. Although Jesus had godly power, he knew he could not use it to save himself. He was there to do his Father's will. Jesus found himself between his unwavering love of his Father and suffering greatly at the hands of the mob. That was his rock and hard place. Although Jesus was deity, he was also human and felt all of the physical and mental pains that humans feel. He knew he was about to be crucified in a very terrible way and would also feel the weight of mankind's sins to the point that he would feel separated from his Father for the first time. Jesus was crucified early the next day on the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, the Passover. He suffered this to pay for man's sins. So let us ask, would we have obeyed God to this level? Could we have restrained our power, our unlimited power, to let these men crucify you? Jesus made the perfect decision. And finally, all of this came about because God put himself between a rock and a hard place. God, the creator of all things, the eternal one that has no limits to his power or love, you may ask, how could he find himself between a rock and a hard place? I don't mean to say that God was limited in his power. I want to make that clear. But he did have a hard decision to make. After God created all things, he created one more creature, mankind. A creature that would be different from all others that he would create, in that he would create them like in the likeness of himself. He gave mankind a soul, and God loved him dearly for this. He created them with the ability to make a free choice between right and wrong. And when they made the decision to disobey his law, God found himself in that hard place. See, God's unlimited love is only matched by his unlimited righteousness. So he was between his love for man and man's need for judgment. How could he punish and separate himself from the man he loved? How could he overlook the disobedience of the creature he created? How could he fix what man had broken? So he had a choice to make. That he would offer up his only son, pay for the sins of his creature. So let's ask, would we have made this decision? Could you make your child pay for the sins of others? That's a very difficult spot to be in. Thankfully for us, God made a divine decision from that hard place. He spared us from the rightful punishment that we deserve for our sins, and we are forever indebted to him. So what we can learn from this is that a good outcome can come from between a rock and a hard place. But that decision has got to be motivated by love rather than selfishness. I think we find that both Peter and Pilate made their decisions based on what benefited them, but God and Jesus made their decision based on love for others. We've been commanded to remember Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection with the simple memorial that's on the table before us. And I ask is that we think about these things and let us not take lightly and fully appreciate the difficulty with which this memorial was established. God, who is all merciful, gave us life at the expense of his son's life. What have we given in return? And finally, I'd like to read a very familiar verse recorded in John. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through him. Whoever believes in him is not condemned. Whoever does not believe is condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of the only Son of God. Amen.